Hello, everybody. We have Aviv Tamar today. He'll be speaking about learning representations for planning. Thank you.
English or Hebrew?
I think that English.
English.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for joining. Not running in the race or running fast enough and coming back. So I'll talk about learning representation for planning. This is my work in the past 3 years approximately. Now, the motivation is that robots today are very good at performing repetitive tasks. For example, counting factors. But my long-term goal is getting robots outside of these well-controlled environments and into the wild. For example, in homes or hospitals, or walking alongside humans in factories, for example. And this is challenging. What if we want, for example, a robot to cook for us or make our bed? Well, we need to deal with unstructured environments. For example, our home looks different every day we come back. The tasks are changing. Every day we solve new tasks. And common factor to many of the tasks that we need to deal with every day involves manipulating and interacting with objects. And currently, general object manipulation is very hard for robotics. So there have been many approaches to trying to generate autonomous robots that can solve tasks autonomously for us. Almost all of them approach the problem by defining the world as some kind of control dynamical system. For example, the robot can act on the world performing actions U. The state of the world is some X, and upon acting, the world transitions to a new state X plus 1. The robot can also observe the world by some function G. And the goal is to find some controller pi that accomplishes some task. And a task can be defined, for example, using a reward function, some constraints that have to be met, or a goal for the robot to achieve. Now, most of the work on this problem has been under the setting that I'll call here planning or optimal control, classical planning control. And the assumption here is that we know the model for the dynamics of the world, and we know the model for the perception. And if we know both of them, then acting optimally becomes a search or optimization problem. And this has been investigated in optimal control, task planning, task and motion planning, and many other approaches. But the assumption that we know the model of the dynamics and the perception is just too strong for getting robots really outside of these well-controlled habitats and to performing general tasks. So let me give you an example. So here's a classical task and motion planning domain. This is setting up a dinner table, something we all want robots to do. And we need to define, for planning what to do here, we need to find states for the environment. A really logical state here would be whether the robot is holding or not holding this cup. And this seems logical for us, that's the way we plan. But for robots, whether this is a good state or not really depends on the sensing that it has. Does it have a force sensor on its wrist or not? That would make identifying whether it's holding a cup or not easy or hard. If you need to identify that from vision, it would be a very hard task. So there's some coupling between the perception of the robot and the way we define the planning problem, which makes these approaches very difficult to apply in non-controlled settings. So the modeling problem has recently led to many people working on a completely different approach, which is Model 3, called Model 3 reinforcement learning. And this has gained a lot of interest recently. The idea is that instead of modeling the world, we just try to optimize the policy, the controller directly using trial and error. We act in the world, we see what we got, and then we try to improve what we are doing. And so this learning directly perception to action, this is great because we don't need any model. But we need some signal to drive our learning. And this is usually a reward signal. Somebody needs to know whether what we did was good or bad to guide our improvement. And designing a reward function, well, that could be hard. For example, for image-based domains, it's hard to design a reward function. But there is something more problematic about it. The fact that we have a reward function during training means that we can only solve the tasks that we saw during training. There is absolutely no guarantee in reinforcement learning that after we solve some tasks, we generalize to different tasks that we haven't seen. Also, RL is data demanding, but more generally, we humans, we solve different tasks every day. I think that most of the time we try to avoid trial and error as much as we can. So it seems funny to kind of base all decision making on trial and error. There's also model-based RL, and here the idea is to first learn some model of the world using some data-driven approach, and then plan on that model to achieve whatever task we want. And in general, this is great. This solves all the problems. It's data-driven, but we also can generalize because we're planning. And it can work very well on some problems. So for example, flying a helicopter, as was done in the past. But on domains where the model is very large, it has a lot of parameters, this doesn't really seem to work. It's very hard to make these things work, for example, using vision input. The best that we've seen on this is getting robots kind of push object or reach to an object. Nothing that comes close to our capabilities on standard planning problems. So we've seen that these three approaches all have some fundamental drawback into getting robots outside of well-controlled habitat and performing autonomous tasks. And my claim in this talk is that if we really want to make progress on this, well, we need to combine ideas from all of these approaches. And today I'll talk about three works that we did along this idea. The first is value direction networks, which is a way to embed planning into the architecture of a neural network. The second is learning assembly from CAD, where we'll use a partial model to plan on and reinforcement learning. And the third is what we can do when we don't have any model at all. Also a different approach to model-based RL using plan imagination. Let me start with value iteration networks. So I've said before that model-free reinforcement learning doesn't generalize. So let me get into that a little bit more in depth. So what do we learn in RL? We learn some policy that maps our observations directly to actions. For training this policy, we need some signals. We need something to backprop on, basically. So in classical reinforcement learning, well, we'll try to maximize the expected sum of the rewards that we receive. This is the signal that drives us. We can also look at imitation learning, where there is an expert that tells us what to do, and we try to copy it. It's a supervised learning problem, where we maximize, for example, the log likelihood of the actions of the expert in our data. Still, in both of these settings, we saw an expert or reward function on some training data or some training domains. But now, what happens when the task changes or the domain changes? There's nothing here that tells us how to modify our planning computation or replan. So to show this, we did a very simple test. This is probably the most simple domain you can think of in reinforcement learning. It's called a grid wall. There is some agent, this red agent here, that can move in this grid, on the white spaces in this grid between the black obstacles, and it needs to go to this goal location marked in green here. And we trained a neural network to map this image of the domain. It sees the whole map, it sees its goal position, its goal, and it tries to map that into what action to take to get to the goal. Now, if you look at it, just a glance is enough to understand a trivial solution here. We trained this using imitation learning to make it super simple. But we trained it on a bunch of these training domains with randomly generated maps that we did. And our question was whether, if we train on these training domains, does this generalize to predict correct trajectories in a new test domain that we haven't seen in our data? And again, this should be trivial. But what we found is that the network that we trained, well, they did very well on the training data, but really didn't generalize to test nets. So they didn't understand the inherent planning computation that actually goes on here, right? We understand that there are obstacles, we plan to go to the goal, and that determines our trajectory. training these neural networks didn't really capture that. So to solve that, we were inspired by ideas from inverse optimal control and inverse reinforcement learning, where instead of directly mapping the policy from observation to action, you can think of something that goes on like this. You map the observation to some model of the domain, for example, this map. You plan in this model a good trajectory, and then from this planning computation, you derive the action that you're taking. Now this seems logical, or this seems like what we would do in our head, but the question is how to train this model. How can we back it this way? Now, note that this is the same structure. It's still a mapping from observation to action, but we need to make all of these, or basically make this a differentiable function so that we can plug into reinforcement learning or orientation learning algorithms. So let me describe one way that this could be done. Here's one classical planning algorithm called value iteration. So let's think of this map, and we want to find the shortest path to the goal. One way you can do it is by defining something called a value function. A value function is the shortest distance for every pixel in this map towards the goal. And the question is, how can you compute such a shortest distance? So here's an iterative algorithm that does it. It's called value iteration. So you go over all the pixels in the map, and you calculate the distance to each of the neighbors, plus what you think is the distance from that neighbor to the goal. And then you minimize over your neighbors, and then you update your estimated distance from this pixel as the minimum over this sum. Now, if you have stochastic transitions, you can just reduce in expectations, so the expectation of the neighbors that you reach. Our insight was that the computation that happens in value iteration, this minimization over an expectation, is actually very similar to a computation that goes on in convolutional neural networks. So we can actually represent this exact computation on the grid world as the following convolution. So we take a map of or an image of our current value function and some cost. This expectation is actually a convolution operator that we apply to each of the pixels with its neighbors. And then we obtain a channel for every action that we have. And then we can minimize over these channels to obtain the next value function here. And then we can repeat this iteratively by feeding back this value into the current value. And what we obtain is a current convolutional neural network with shared weights. These convolutional weights are shared because its expectation is always the same. So actually, this doesn't really have to be specific to grid walls. This is just a linear operator which can represent it as a convolution followed by minimization. So this is actually differentiable. Now with this insight that we can represent a planning algorithm as a particular convolutional neural network, we designed something that we call a value iteration network, which takes our observation, maps it to some reward or cost using a standard coordinate. Then this cost gets, we plan on this cost using the value iteration network, value iteration algorithm, just so, which is a coordinate. And then from this, we derive the action. Now, this is what we wanted. We go from observation to some model for reward and transitions. We plan on this model, and then we get the action. But because all of these components are just neural network components, it's clear that we can backward through this. So it's clear that it's a differentiable computation. Now, we can backward through the whole thing, but the question is, what do we learn from this? What we would be learning is a planning computation that actually explains the actions that we see in our data, if it's the expert or the reward function. So when we tried this on these grid walls, it worked much better. So here's an experiment. We compare this to different neural network baselines. This is a standard coordinate, and this is a fully convolutional neural network. And we compared the performance to different size maps. And on small maps, well, all of these networks are pretty good because you can kind of memorize all the good solutions. But when you increase the size of the map, memorizing solutions doesn't really scale. And we see that these baselines really degrade in performance, while value iteration networks are still good. Here's an example of a trajectory that it predicts in red compared with the shortest path in blue. And we can actually visualize what it learned here because we can visualize the reward function that it learned for this map. And we see something interesting. We see that it learned to put a high reward on the goal, a negative reward on the obstacles, and a small yet negative reward on all the free space. And well, this explains that it should take the shortest path towards the goal. And this is a planning computation that it explains the data that it saw. In the data, we gave it the shortest path using some planning algorithm. So it learned to fit a reward function that actually, when planning using that reward function, explains our data. So since that work, there have been many other approaches to using differentiable planning algorithms as policies. We extend this work for manipulation using some a differentiable linear quadratic regulator. There was a really cool work from Berkeley that combined a value iteration map with some component that learns to take a first-person view of an image and map it to this kind of map. So it learned to navigate from first-person view on new buildings. A work from Michigan used this for Atari using planning on a graph. And recently, universal planning networks really extended this to general neural network planning.
So what is the benefit actually? That you can work directly on images?
So the benefit is, this is exactly the next slide. The benefit is that we're injecting some inductive bias into our architecture. We have a neural network, but we know that this neural network should compute the result of some planning algorithm. So if we inject this inductive bias, usually this results in better performance and better generalization. And also interpretability in some cases, because, for example, we can see what it actually learns. But this is still not a silver bullet for all domains. We really need to design carefully this planning algorithm to fit a particular problem that we have in hand. So there's still some way to go into generalizing these ideas. So now I'd like to talk about a different work, which combines a partial model with model fit reinforcement. And this is on learning robotic assembly from CAD. So first, some motivation. Robots in industry are pretty popular, and they're getting more popular every day. But something is happening to industry in the past few years, which is called Industry 4.0, which kind of shortens the cycles of most steps in a production. So for example, shipping times are really being reduced, for example, by automatic warehouses like Amazon. Manufacturing has been the times of manufacturing has been reduced, for example, using 3D printing. So the total time for designing a product to actually obtaining it has drastically been reduced. And this allows for new ideas like customizable projects. So for example, if you're going to order a computer or a phone, you might in the future design yourself where the buttons are going to be or what exactly are going to be the components, and that would be customized for your for whatever you want and delivered to you. But currently, one bottleneck that is kind of limiting these ideas is assembly. So currently, assembly is done either by robots or by people. People has its own flaws, and for robots, designing or engineering the actual algorithms for assembly currently requires a lot of engineering time. Too much time for this to be feasible to rapidly change to customizable products. And there's a lot of interest in designing assembly controllers that can adjust to changes in the design. For this we want learning. But we have some advantages in the assembly task, particularly in industrial assembly. So in a realistic setting, where we have the design of a product. So for example, we know the geometry. We have CAD files that are used to print the product, the product. So we can design how we want the assembly to take place, but then the robot actually needs to do it. And this is challenging because then we need to deal with dynamics, we need to deal with friction, pole estimation. So let's first talk about the geometry part. There's a lot of work on motion planning. It's a mature field. Motion planning solves the problem of how to get from one particular point to another particular point in space between obstacles. And given some geometries of objects, we can use motion planning to find out a good trajectory that we want to follow. But then following it, that could be difficult. Here's an example why. So let's say I want to insert this peg into this hole. This is a classical assembly problem. And let's say that I think that my hole is in the green position, but it's actually in the red position, to some pole estimation error. So a standard controller would tell me that I need to push down. But that would actually get me stuck in the real position. What I need to do is first move it to the right and then move it downwards. Such a controller is much more complicated to write, and this requires a lot of time. And this is where learning can actually help us. But first, let me convince you that this is actually the case in practice. This is, for example, an off-the-shelf motion planning and control package called Move It, and it's trying to do this exact thing, insert this package in the hole, and it fails because of what I did. Now, you can say, okay, my model is bad, I don't want to model at all, let's go reinforcement learning on the problem. But this isn't expected to work as well, right? Because we need a really good reward function to tell us that we need, for example, insert this peg over the top here and then that. If we go with a naive reward function that, for example, just penalizes the distance to our goal, a very good local minimum would be just, stick this to the side here and that's a good local minimum. Here's an example of that. It's a state-of-the-art reinforcement learning algorithm trying to solve these tasks. And according to RL, it's currently optimal. It solved the task, it maximizes the reward, it can't do any better. Same with the peg. Now, the chance that by trial and error we would identify that we need to go over this shaft, insert it correctly, and then get a lower reward is absolutely basically zero. So clearly that's not the way to go. So we need a better reward function. Our idea here was to combine motion planning to shape the reward function so that we can utilize both the geometry and the reinforcement learning. So we define here's a cost function. We define the cost function as the sum of distances from a current position to the reference trajectory, which is the motion plan. XTRF is what we get from the motion plan. And the idea here is that because we're looking at the sum of these costs, even if at some position we can't really be exactly on the trajectory, we'll allow ourselves to stray a little away, just as later in the sequence we'll minimize the other costs to get back. Now, for reinforcement learning here, we wanted to use a very efficient algorithm because we wanted this to run on the robot. We used an algorithm called iterative LTG. The idea is that you start with some policy, and you just run it in the real world and obtain some samples and fit a linear dynamics model to these samples. So it's a time-varying linear model of the dynamics. Given these linear dynamics, we can calculate the optimal controller using LTG, and we get a new controller. And then we obtain more samples using this controller, collect more data, improve our model, and so on until we converge on an optimal policy. One huge benefit of this type of algorithm was that the resulting policies in each step are linear. That's by definition of the linear quadratic Gaussian problem. And that means that we can initialize this algorithm with a standard PD tracking controller, which is also linear in the state. So that by itself it doesn't solve the task, but it's a very good starting position. It's a start. So the whole system that we have is first have the CAD models in the geometry. We use the robot's perception system to localize where all the objects are located in the scene. And we know what the goal state is. Then we use motion planning to plan a trajectory for the robot, which is goal. And then we use this as shaping for reinforcement learning algorithm. Here is an example of some tasks that we can solve with this. This is insertion of very tight-fitting parts, less than a millimeter of tolerance, using a very imprecise Gear 2 robot. You see that, well, learning to twist this object, this was a part of the motion planning. This is something that we didn't need to learn, we actually computed, but getting it into to fit, this was important. Here's an example of this gear insertion. And you see that the robot learns to be kind of compliant when it's on the shaft. Now this robot doesn't have any force torque sensors. It's only sensing its joint positions. So it really needed to understand that when it's in this part of the state space, it needs to apply compliant control. And this is peg insertion of support.
So how long does it take to teach your robot?
Great question. It's my next slide. About 30 minutes, approximately, depending on the task. So it takes about 5 iterations. What you see here, each iteration is about 5 rollouts of the policy. So it's a quick algorithm. The factors that contribute to this is that the algorithm itself, ILPG, is a good algorithm for these tasks, and the fact that we initialize it with the PD controller. In terms of success rate, we compared our success rate to both just the RL algorithm and the off-the-shelf planning and control package, MoveIt, which used exactly the same motion plans, just without the reinforcement learning. So this baseline didn't manage to solve any task. The RL managed to solve just a peg insertion in a very simple scenario when you start exactly above the hole, so you don't really need to explode. And our algorithm solved all of that.
So your algorithm only failed once on an easy task?
Yeah, I guess it's noise. The easiness here is where it's the starting position. All right, so the message here, the main message here is that, first of all, if you have prior knowledge, well, definitely use it. And geometric data is a very powerful type of prior knowledge. It is also very easy to obtain in many realistic industrial settings. And RL is great for fine-tuning on the real world.
You said you gave the CAD as an additional input CAD?
Yes, the CAD, well, from the CAD models, we know what the shapes are. So think, for example, of these interlocking shapes. We have the 3D CAD files, so we know how a trajectory that doesn't hit one another towards the goal looks like. And then we just need to follow that trajectory.
How do you feed the CAD into the network?
The CAD doesn't go into the network. The CAD is used using standard motion planning tools to compute a trajectory that the robot needs to follow to execute a critical task. So the CAD only gives you the trajectory that you want to follow.
Can I understand well, the only thing that you change is the linear controller is A and B? It's the only thing that you change?
No, in the reward function.
The reward is the distances you take from the CAD.
The reward is the distances, the time-wise distance to the motion path. And that's the only input to reinforcement learning algorithm.
He's asking what you learn. What are the parameters?
The parameters of the linear.
Oh, the linear controller. Okay, so the linear controller is, yeah, you're given the current state, which is the positions of velocities of the robot joints. We're learning a linear controller for the torques of the robot, what torque to apply in each joint.
So each step that will change A and B? This is the AX.
Yes, we learn new A and B. So it's a linear feedback control that we learn.
So this could be done without deep learning. This part.
If you had a perfect model for the system, you could solve it without deep learning. learning the model for these domains is not trivial. So for example, these parts are 3D printed. It's really not easy to pre-compute the friction that you'd have at every point in time because you have small discontinuities and things like that. So computing a model for these tasks is not trivial.
So basically you're using RL not to solve the planning problem, but to learn the dynamics model.
Yes. Well, it's to make the plan work under the actual dynamics, basically.
To execute the plan.
Yes, to execute it.
It's the linear, the local model, the linear local model, this H step.
Yes, it's locally linear.
It's not a full model.
Exactly. Any other questions before I move? All right, so we saw that geometric knowledge is really powerful. And when we can obtain it, then that's great. But some tasks, geometric model is not very easy to obtain. So you can think, for example, of the pillow case that we had in the beginning. You really don't want to build a 3D CAD model for a pillow and plan or do motion planning on that. So what can we do for objects that we don't have or can't obtain manual models for? So now I'll talk about a new approach for learning such models in a data-driven way. But before I start, I want to play a little game with you. So here's an image of the rope. And I'd like you to imagine, really as vividly as possible, how would you take this rope and manipulate it into this loop shape that you see here. And if that was easy, maybe you can think on how to manipulate it into this knot, which also should be easy. This, I'm not sure you've seen before, but pretty sure that with a few seconds, you'd have a very clear mental video in your head on how you take this rope and make this weird knot. So my point here is that we humans, we have a very strong capability to predict and plan the course of our actions when we manipulate objects. And it might be that this is crucial for actually solving the complex tasks that we solve every day. And what we wanted to see is whether we can replicate these ideas or do this with robots. So to set up this problem, we formulated what we call a visual planning problem. And the idea is this. You first obtain data about an object from some unsupervised interaction. So for this, in this example, and this is data that we didn't collect from a year ago, the robot simply picks the rope in a random location, moves it slightly, and drops it down. This generates a lot of data, a lot of videos like this, which essentially contain information about the physics of the object. So for example, for this you can learn that the rope can, for example, split in half or jump to wildly in the sea. Okay? So we want to take this data with pairs of observations, O and O prime, and then what we want to do is, given some image of the rope that we start from and some goal image, we want to complete this video that we could do in our head. We want to complete the video of how to go from this image towards that image. But these images must satisfy kind of causality or physics that we saw in our data. So again, the rope can't do two wild things to go from here to there. And if we can do this, then first we have a interpretable plan to work on, and we can use it later as a reference, for example, for control, like we saw earlier in the CAD. So to solve this problem, we were inspired by recent results using GANs, where we saw that GANs can take data, for example, of images, and learn to imagine similar images and also to interpolate between different images, like we see here for different faces. So we thought, well, maybe you can train a GAN on our data and just interpolate between the starting and ending image, and that will give us some plan. So what is a GAN? A GAN is a neural network that takes as input some noise vector C. from some known distribution, typically Gaussian. G is a neural network called a generator that maps this random noise into an image, O. And again, also has a discriminator neural network which takes this image and maps it to a binary decision where this image is real, meaning it came from our data, or not real, meaning it came from the generator. So training this discriminator is just binary classification, but again is trained by playing this game between the generator and the discriminator. The generator is trained to try to fool the discriminator. And again, so when you train them by playing this game, the generator eventually converges to the distribution of your data, because that's the only way it can actually fool the discriminator. So we train again on this data, and this is what it does. Unfortunately, you can't really see the images here, but it didn't really work well. So for example, well, this tradition doesn't look like something that would happen in our data, nor these ones. And well, this makes sense. This GAN is just trained on reproducing images. There's nothing here for it to learn about the dynamics. We then asked, well, maybe it's about the structure of the latent space, the noise. And there are results, or there's recent work on something called InfoGAN, which tries to learn a structured noise by maximizing the mutual information between this noise and observations. This has been shown to produce state spaces that are structured, for example, with components that correspond to the shape of a chair or the width of the chair, like that. We tried this, and this also didn't work exactly for the same reason. There's nothing here about dynamics.
InfoGAN is defined for classes, no? How did you...
A state is just a class. It's just this should be a class. I'm calling the state just for that because of the way we're going to extend it in a second. But this is, you can think of it as a discrete or continuous class. So we wanted to account for dynamics. So we did two things. First is we had our GAN generate pairs of observations, O and O prime. Now, if it generates pairs, it has to kind of capture the dynamics in the data, because if it converges the distribution of pairs, then it has to know what makes next observation feasible. Now, for the states, well, we eventually would like interpolation between different states to make sense. The way we did this is we structured the latent space to have a state and a next state with some transition, and we maximize the mutual information between these pairs of observation and these pairs of states. The intuition here is that we want to learn or structure it so that find the state transitions which are maximally informative about the observation relation that we saw.
So basically, you're learning a successor generator.
In some, and we're
Yes,
inventing it
in a weird space.
We hope that this space will capture the the important part of what makes the next observation, and this noise will capture the less important parts.
Where's the transition?
Well, I'll talk about exactly what it is, but for now, you can think of it as another component in this network that we learn. So here's a transition for linear interpolation. We wanted that linear interpolation between states would make sense. That means it has to have high probability. The way you do this is to say that these transitions are a local perturbation of the state. This means that if you can only move locally around your state, then interpolating between different remote states always has some high probability, so linear interpolation should make sense. So you can see that it now learned to generate something that looks like a physical manipulation of this rope from the left image to the right.
Pointer don't work.
Yeah, well, so you see that these are a grayscale, but it looks like a feasible trajectory from the left image to the right one. And we can also measure this numerically. We train a classifier to predict whether two consecutive images we predict are feasible according to the data or not, and we got a much higher score compared to the spacetimes. I think that the most, the clearest way to see it is now we have this thing. Bad luck with this slide. But you see that it can actually capture reasonable imagined sequences for non-trivial shapes of the world, for example, this S shape or this loop that you see here. And so actually this is just a way of generating world images. It's actually a more general way of representing state spaces for planning. And to explain this, I want to get a little bit more in depth about what we did in this model. So we have two novel things here. First is that we're generating pairs of observations from pairs of states, and the second is this mutual information term. So let's go over each one of them. First, the mutual information. So we want to maximize the mutual information between the pair of observations and the pair of states. We're using a variational lower bound that was developed for the InfoGAN model, which basically means that alongside training this GAN, we're also training a classifier to classify the generated observations into the states that generated them. Now there's a subtle point to make here. Eventually we would want these states, S and S prime, to kind of share or live in the same state space, because eventually we want to plan a long sequence of states. Mutual information, by definition, doesn't care whether S and S prime has the same meaning. It's you can permute, for example, the symbols of your alphabet, and that won't change the mutual information. Now, to fix this issue, we just had two networks Q that were the same to go from O to S and from O prime to S prime. This means that they have the same meaning. The second thing is, what is this state space and state transitions? So we saw one example with continuous states and just random noise. But what do we want these states to have? We want it first to be backprobable. We want to train this whole thing. And we want it to be plannable. We want to eventually easily plan from some state to another. So here's I want to show a different way to start with this. Another type of state could be a binary state space. So S is a binary vector. And this is a classical representation in classical planning, where each element in the state is called a predicate. But typically in classical planning, these predicates are manually defined. But here they would be learned. They would be learned in such a way that maximize the information about the transitions in the observations that we see. To actually back up to sort of things, well, we use some recent developments called stochastic neural networks and the Ganglia softmaps. But let me show you an example of what it actually means in the binary state space. Here's a toy domain. This is a particle moving in a 2D state space. So the observations here are just the 2D positions of the particle. And to generate data here instead of a robot, we just move this particle using random motion. And we want to generate this data and eventually use this data to plan a trajectory, for example, from going from the start to the goal. Now we structured this domain in a very particular way. It's structured such that the Euclidean metric is completely non-informative for planning. Why? Because, for example, these two tunnels are very close in space, but they are not connected. So it's clear that they should have different meanings in our representation. So if you're talking about a binary state space, we have a discrete set of symbols. And learning the representation here is equivalent to just clustering the state space to a finite set of clusters. So a standard comparison or standard baseline here would be clustering algorithms, for example, k-means. And here's where the Euclidean thing becomes important. So standard clustering algorithms need some metric to cluster a state space. And the k-means, for example, clusters both of these tunnels under the same cluster. Puzzle InfoGAN, which I forgot to say was the name of our model, Puzzle InfoGAN actually cares about the transitions. It never saw a transition from the upper part of the space to the lower part. So it learned not to put them on the same cluster. Now these clusters are much more informative for planning. How do you do this planning? So first of all, we take observations from the start of the goal and use the classifier to get their corresponding states or clusters. This is just a Q function that we have from the information lower bound. To plan, in this case, we just search on this graph. And then from a trajectory in the state space, we generate a trajectory in observation space using the GAN generator. The GAN generator knows how to map from states to observations. We made it a little bit better by using Monte Carlo samples and using the discriminator to select the best one. Now, here's an example of what it looks like. For the starting point, it's going to imagine trajectories to one of these points here. It didn't imagine a trajectory to these points because there is no such condition. We compared it also numerically to these baselines, which all rely in the Euclidean metrics in some sense, and they all fail. All right, just to go back to how we did the planning for the images and growth, it's basically the same idea, but the details, of course, are different. The classifier wasn't good enough for mapping observations to state, so we just searched directly in image space for the best fit for the state. Planning was done using linear interpolation, as I said, and the GAN discriminator also wasn't really good enough, so we selected the best trajectory using a discriminatively trained classifier. Now, all of these modifications were the same for the baselines, the GAN and InfoGAN, so the numerical comparison was still fair. So we saw that we can imagine trajectories in a data-driven way. Now we can use them for action. What do we need? We need a way to track a visual planet we imagine. But this is easy. If our data of pairs O and O prime also contain the action that transitions O to O prime, so for example, here we pick the rope over here and move it slightly to the left, then we can learn something called an inverse model, which goes to from these pairs of observations to the action that generated them. And this is just supervised learning. Once we have that, and the plan that we imagined or reference, we can look at our current observation, use the inverse model to calculate the action. This would be a controller, basically, that brings us closer to O equals 1. We'll see a new observation, and so on and so on. This is basically a feedback controller in image space. We can also replan if we wanted, but we actually didn't need that. So here's an example of this on a very simple domain. There are two blocks on this table. We can move them. The observations are images, and we want to plan to go, for example, from the point on the left to the image on the right. And this is, we trained a causal InfoGAN model. This is what it imagined, and this is what happened when we executed it using the inverse model. So it seems fairly well. We wanted to compare it to some baseline. And the natural baseline here would be a model-free reinforcement learning algorithm, VATRL in this case, that takes the same data that we have, but then tries to solve the problem using, for example, a fitted cube. So there are some complications for making this work. We need to define what the states and the rewards are. So for the states, we just encoded the images using a VAE. And for the reward, we'll use the distance in the latent space, which is something that people recently did and worked well for them. And there's also the problem of generalization. So we said in the beginning that RL doesn't generalize. How can we learn on our data and expect to generalize to tasks that we haven't seen? Well, we can't, but we wanted to make it super easy for RL as a baseline. So for each goal, we retrained the whole model on all our data. But still, when we tried that, reinforcement learning really didn't work well. Its success rate was horrible. This is the success rate of our method. So we then try to say, okay, well, maybe we can give some other benefits to reinforcement learning. First of all, we try to use the real reward function instead of this learn one, because this is simulation, we can do that. Also didn't help. And then we let RL work with the real state space, the positions of the blocks, and that finally got it to someplace near our model. So why does reinforcement learning failure? It fails because it sometimes encounters something that it didn't see in the data. So for example, some actions can push the blocks off the table. And the Q function can have some actions, or the maximum of the Q function can cause it to do that. Our method, on the other hand, only imagines things that it saw in the data. Since it never saw the blocks falling off the table, it never imagined that. So it never tries to actually do that. Okay, here's a more interesting example. This is, again, rope manipulation. But here we also added some obstacles. So this yellow and red obstacles. The idea was to simulate a problem called wire threading. Wire threading is when you want to thread wires between different components, for example, when you set up a computer. This is a very challenging and very important industrial application that currently doesn't have a really good solution. So this was some example of that. When we collected the data, we moved the obstacles on this breadboard, and we wanted to see that we can actually generalize to new positions of them. So we just collected data in unsupervised web, and then we trained a causal info-GAN model, and then given a start and goal observation, we first plan the sequence of images that we think are a solved task, and then we use the inverse model to execute it on real world. So what you see here on the right is the images that it imagines, or trajectory that it imagines. On the left, on the top left, is the image that it currently sees, and then it uses the inverse model matched with the image in the plan to take an action. And you see that it eventually executes the plan that it imagines. So, first of all, we still have a way to go. The success rate of this is not yet great, it's about 20%, but it is mostly due to data, and we're now improving that with more data collection. But I think that there are two very important things to note here, which I think are very important. First is the interpretability. Before we take any robot action, we know what the robot is planning to do. So we have a visual plan of that. And if it's something that looks unsafe to us or doesn't look reasonable, we can stop the action, the robot, before it does anything. Another thing that relates to this is model selection. Now, when we train the policy for the robot, obviously we have different models that we need to select from. And here we can do model selection just by inspecting the trajectories that it imagines. So obviously here we train GANs, we had tens of models that we needed to kind of filter and throw away because they didn't generate good enough plans. And only when we found a model that imagines well, only then we actually tested it on the real robot. And this was a huge save in time. Running robots on experimental robots, well, if we needed to do this without this model selection phase, this wouldn't have happened. So to conclude, we suggested the problem of visual planning, and we suggested one deep generative model that can be used to solve it by structuring the latent space so that it's easy to plan with. The main benefit, in my opinion, here is that the plans that we get are visually interpretable. We know what the robot is trying to do. And in some sense, it bridges classical planning with modern representation learning. And we saw that this actually can work for visual tracking and control. In a more general sense, you can think of what we did here is, well, we've learned kind of what rope is according to the data that we have. We learn what it can do and what it can't do. And then you can think of building more models for different objects and then combining different objects and also generalizing to objects that we haven't seen. For example, if we've seen 3 types of ropes, we might imagine what would happen to a rope that we haven't seen before. And you can kind of build a library of these objects for a robot in a lifelong learning way that collects more and more data about the object that it interacts with. And this is a very different approach to lifelong learning from the enforcement learning point of view, which tries to build more and more policies for the individual objects. So, going back from what I started with, visual planning is a combination of these ideas. So first of all, there's no reward function, so it's not RL, and we plan. So it's related to classical planning. And there's a clear definition of generalization. We want to generalize how to imagine plans for goals that we haven't seen in our data. And we've seen that if we can do this, well, it's an interpretable basis for control, and it actually works pretty well. With that, I would like to conclude. Thank all my collaborators.
How do you tackle the stochastic policies when you can't claim from the beginning to the end you have something to?
Yeah, well, the way I showed it right now, it's mainly for. Well, the assumption here is that you can the world is kind of deterministic, or you can the only non-determinism happens in your controller, but you can replan. So for example, if you plan something and you reached a different state that you didn't encounter, you can replan from that state on.
How can you supervise the guns, like gives the guns states if you didn't visit them? You have to visit if you want to generate more models using the guns. You need to.
Yeah, well, the assumption here is there are two answers to two parts of these answers. So the way we do this here is we assume that the training data kind of covers all the interesting state space. So you only need to interpolate between what you've seen, which you can't really look for. But what we can do is give some context as input to the GAN. So for example, when we had these obstacles, we generated the position of the obstacles. I didn't actually forgot to mention it. We gave the GAN an image of the current position of the obstacles. So in this way you can generalize. So if you see many configurations of the obstacles, given a new image, you expect your model to generalize. And you can do this for example, different types of objects.
How can you generate a sequence of those rogue images that you showed? Are they conditional on data? I mean, you learn by training the GAN, you learn tuples, pairs of them.
Yes.
When you are generating a pair, how can you make sure that the next pair ties?
So we use the discriminator we generated a bunch of these pairs, and we use the discriminator to select the best one. So, yeah.
Do you have any plans to generalize over different domains? So take something from, let's say, the rogue domain and do it to, I don't know, a ribbon or something else?
So I think the first thing we're going to try to do is what I had said before, is do this context conditional in some way. So for example, you've seen 10 different types of ropes, and you want to generalize to a new rope that you haven't seen before, but you give the image of the new rope as input to the game. So you imagine conditioned on image of what you're currently trying to manipulate, how you would be, what are the possible manipulations of that.
That's the thing.